Arthur Shelby, the anti-hero we all love, the protective big brother who loves to scrap, the loyal friend and family member who's willing to go above and beyond for the people he loves.
My f***ing car, I'll drive to your house, you know I will. I'll stay there all night if I have to. I won't go nowhere.
He's perhaps the character with the funniest or most memorable one-liners throughout the series, and is certainly no stranger to violence or criminal activity. But if you're as curious as me, you've probably thought to yourself, what really goes inside of the mind of Arthur Shelby? Well, nobody really knows for sure, but here's my take on it. For those of you who haven't seen the show, Arthur is the oldest brother of the Shelby siblings. He starts out in season 1 as the main head over the family, with his aunt Polly playing the unofficial boss to guide him and the family along. Given the fact that his father abandoned him and his mother passed away when he was very young, it's understood that he automatically assumed that responsibility as the leader of the family until Polly, his aunt, took over when he had to leave for his military service in France. Early on in the first season, we see him trying to assert himself as the leader by giving orders to his brother Tommy and the rest of the family about certain errands and plans for the family business. But even then, it's quite clear that Arthur recognized that he might not be cut out to be the boss. Even if he would like to see himself as a natural leader, his skill sets and his lack of ability to think big picture makes him somewhat unsuited for the role, especially as the reputation of the family reaches wider circles and have to deal with more complex problems. Post-traumatic stress disorder and mental health issues in general is a major subplot throughout the show. We get to follow a ill but functional family that suffers from different forms of mental illnesses, most prominently depression and anxiety. Mental illness appears to be hereditary within the Shelby bloodline. Both Arthur's mother and father dealt with it. This mental instability is exacerbated by the horrors of the war they had to endure in France. They've all been put back into society just like nothing ever happened and are supposed to act normal without any real medical help. We know through a conversation between him and his younger brother Tommy that Arthur have been going through suicidal thoughts as early as in his youth that stretches all the way up to his adulthood, and he's now having to deal with that additional suffering of post-traumatic stress disorder caused by the war to his mental cocktail of complexity and anxiety. Judging by the traits he's been known to prominently exhibit throughout the show in his default mode, my guess would be that he would score pretty high on openness, neuroticism, and extroversion within the scale of the Big 5 psychological personality metric. Of those 3 metrics previously mentioned, my guess would be that he'd score the highest on neuroticism. Neuroticism is one of the Big 5 high-order personality traits in the study of psychology. Reading directly from Wikipedia, it says that individuals who score high on neuroticism are more likely than average to be moody and to experience such feelings as anxiety, worry, fear, anger, frustration, envy, jealousy, guilt, depression, and loneliness. Although that's very broad and a general description, I'd say that it describes Arthur reasonably well, even though there are other characters in the show who also display these characteristics. I'd even argue that Arthur is the most severe case, bar Danny Whizbang. If we keep reading the page on Wikipedia, it also says that people who are neurotic respond worse to stressors. They're also more likely to interpret ordinary situations as threatening and minor frustrations as hopelessly difficult. It also suggests that they are often self-conscious and shy, and they may have trouble controlling urges and delaying gratification. By all of the adjectives that exist in the English language, shy isn't one of them that I'd use to describe Arthur. But again, this is a general description and is only meant to give someone a general idea of the individual's psychological profile. Lastly, the description of high cases of neuroticism says that people with high neuroticism indexes are at risk for the development of common mental disorders such as mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and substance use disorders that are all symptoms of which had traditionally been called neurosis. High levels of neuroticism combined with traits of openness and extroversion tend to lead to adventure-seeking personalities that are both charming but also highly emotionally reactive in social situations. This is partly Arthur's biggest asset and his biggest liability, along with his drug abuse. It's his biggest asset in the sense that he's highly attuned to the tiniest of emotional tensions in any social interaction and can spot incoming hostility and danger before it's clear to Tommy or the other people around him that something is going to occur. The flip side of this is that Because he's so emotionally sensitive, some of the danger he senses are sometimes self-imposed and self-inflicted by himself based on his own anticipation and aggressive nature, which makes him a magnet for confrontation. My own belief is that some, not all, but some of his aggressive nature stems from his father's abandonment and his constant feeling that he needs to prove himself to other men in order to be respected or seen as being enough. This is especially true in younger men who usually learns how to be men mostly through their interactions with male role models. Without those interactions, men can grow up to be unsure of how they should behave around other men. In an article for Psychology Today entitled Fathers and Sons, psychologist Frank Pittman shares some insights on the consequences of growing up without a father figure. He says in the article published as recent as 2018 that young adolescent boys look to their father figures to tell them if they're good enough to be men. And without paternal approval, adolescent boys experience emotional pain which can lead to attempts to prove themselves later on in life. These include intense competition with other boys, engaging in risky behaviors, and criminal tough guy behavior intended to scare the world into seeing them as real men. Now, I know what you think. This holds true for all the Shelby boys, but I believe it's particularly applicable to Arthur. The Shelby family situation is very delicate. The family are and we often see people make degrading, malevolent remarks and react very judgmental upon hearing the origin of their heritage. We see people suggest that they're lazy, take government handouts, and accuse them of being liars, thieves, and crooks. And I think it's reasonable to assume that this has had a generational impact on Arthur's ability to gain upward trajectory through lawful means. It most likely affected his ability to get a real job and education, since there were no laws protecting minority groups from discrimination in place during the time he was alive. Usually, when roadblocks are put in people's paths when they're trying to better their lives through legitimate means, they naturally grow resentful towards a system that treats them unequally. And crime is, unfortunately, a very obvious loophole in gaining upward trajectory in a system that one believes is unfair and cruel. Speaking of cruel, Arthur's longing for a father figure became very apparent when his biological father came back to Birmingham and briefly reappeared in his life.
How about I keep my money and you shove a licence up your arse crack?
No, you don't want to speak to me like that.
And who the bloody hell do you think you are?
My name ain't Arthur Shelby!
Dad?
Jesus.
Again, I'm by no means a psychologist, I'm just a fan of the show speculating, but the way Arthur quickly embraced his father's return, despite their history, makes me think that Arthur has an anxious, ambivalent attachment style. An anxious, ambivalent attachment style is in simple terms when an infant feels separation anxiety when separated from the caregiver and doesn't feel reassured when the caregiver returns to the infant, and thus remains looking for proof of love and affection anywhere and everywhere when they are adults. This theory is based on a classical study called The Strange Situation by the psychologist Mary Ainsworth if you want to look it up. In their adulthoods, anxious, ambivalent people tend to become more distrustful of others and seek to verify the relationship, often with extreme behaviors that can backfire and alienate the other person. They tend to cling to their attachment figures and often act desperate for their attention, just like we saw Arthur do to his father. He wanted his relationship with his father to be differently so bad that he gave his father money from the company without the permission of Thomas or Polly. But he soon realized that his father is in fact the same selfish liar he has always been. Arthur tries to confront his father later on before he leaves for good, but becomes intimidated by the old man's strength and anger.
Well, at least we got to say goodbye, son. And bid a fond adieu to your dear brothers, would ya?
How could you do this to us?
Well, if the truth be told, I'm not so acquainted with that promised land as I had thee believe.
You're a f***ing liar. And a thief.
Now you give me back my f***ing money!
The event causes Arthur to re-evaluate himself, and as a result, he comes to the conclusion that he's not worthy of anyone's love and attempts suicide by hanging himself. However, his plan fails when the rope tears from the hook. Like I've mentioned previously, Arthur has struggled with suicidal thoughts as early as in his youth. Unfortunately, suicide is a conclusion that is more common amongst men than what most people might believe. While females are reported to be more likely to experience suicidal thoughts, males are much more likely to actually commit to taking their own lives. A study by the world-renowned World Health Organization has shown that the male-female suicide ratio are 4:1 in Europe and 3.6:1 in America. That means that on average, for every woman that takes her own life, there's roughly 4 other men who've done the same thing. After Arthur's incident, Polly later discovers the rope marks around his neck from the failed suicide attempt. She informs Tommy about it and encourages him to pay his brother a visit. Arthur later confesses to Tommy about how his head is like a barge with cargo swaying back and forth from end to end inside of his head. Upon hearing this confession, Tommy seems to be bothered by it. And when I watched it for the first time, I got a bit confused by it. But now I think that in Tommy's case, it's because he recognized what Arthur is describing within himself. And out of frustration, he becomes slightly annoyed that he himself seemed to be able to function while living with post-traumatic stress disorder, and Arthur isn't, and that might say something about his character. The conversation forced him to confront his own mental illness in this very almost non-existent framework that he had back then for dealing with mental health issues. They didn't even have a name for post-traumatic stress disorder or shell shock back then. It was just called the Flanders Blues. They had no idea that what they were going through is completely normal for homecoming combat veterans. And instead of embracing this moment of self-reflection and open up about his own mental battles, Tommy tells Arthur to basically put a lid on it, like he does himself. He even reinforced this belief in season 1 when he tells Grace that men don't talk about things, that's what men do. But Arthur is desperately yearning for someone with compassion and a safe outlet to express his own feelings, and that is exactly where his ex-wife Linda comes into place. She helps an increasingly unhinged Arthur, accused with war trauma, to slowly but surely put his life back together and deal with his mental health issues, primarily by helping him stay sober as much as she can and allow the Almighty God into his life to help him carry his problems and forgive him for some of his sins. And I put an emphasis on some in that previous statement because I'm not sure that all of his sins are forgivable. My perception of Arthur is that his whole life has consisted of chaos and betrayal, and he's desperately in need of some stability in his life. And he finds some of it in Linda's orderliness and strictness. What Linda does is offer Arthur some grounding when his own emotions carries him away. He needs a woman like Linda to balance himself out. A lot of people say that Linda holds Arthur back, but what she brings is some sanity to his own life. I think with Linda's help, he may eventually put the murdering and killing behind him eventually, and slowly but surely decide to spend more and more quality time with his only son Billy in the back of his garden or something. But then, spoiler alert, they broke up. I honestly believe that as long as she was there was some hope for him. Now that they've parted ways, it's going to be very interesting to see where Arthur's mind goes from here. Especially when you keep in mind that Arthur is controlled by his younger brother Tommy, who is steering him deeper and deeper into the criminal lifestyle. And again, I'm sure I haven't addressed the entirety of Arthur's psychological profile, and there's probably a bunch of you who don't agree with my analysis, but that's fine. Whether you disagree with me or not, I'd like for you to comment your thoughts or phrase your own analysis down below in the comment section, and let's have a conversation about it. Also, if you've seen this show already, don't forget to comment what your favorite Arthur moment or quote is. With that being said, if you like this type of videos, be sure to like the video and subscribe. Peace.